Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we're going to be going through the discography of Pavement. Pavement is undeniably a very important band that contributed so much to 90s music and would go down as one of the most influential bands of the entire indie rock genre. Their music is always surprising and contains this amazing fusion of so many different elements like pop, lo-fi, indie, alternative, experimental, noise rock, and punk. And the music that they produced really had so much personality and character to it, which always made for an enjoyable and very adventurous listen. And I think because of the wide range of sounds that they offer to the listener, Pavement tends to be a group where everyone's rankings of their albums is kind of all over the place, and there's really so much diversity of opinion within the Pavement community. And I always think that those types of groups make for the most interesting album discussions. And although they have a short discography in comparison to a lot of other groups, their influence and contribution cannot be understated, and I would definitely consider them to be one of the great bands of the 90s. So I'm very happy to be covering them for today's episode, and what I'm going to do is go through their 5 studio albums, starting with Slanted and Enchanted and going up to Terror, Twilight. And I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 5 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1992 titled Slanted and Enchanted, and I will give this one an S. Amazing album. Not my number one favorite of theirs, but still a very solid first release. This is their first of 5 records that they would do for Matador Records, and this one is by far their most lo-fi of their 5 albums, with a very raw and dirty production style, fusing together flavors of indie rock and noise pop. And this is considered a classic album in the slacker rock genre and utilizes the slacker guitar tuning, which is D-A-D-A-B-E, giving us our first taste of the many interesting alternate guitar tunings that Steven and Scott will continue to use on future releases. And I would say that that is definitely one of my favorite elements of the Pavement sound as a guitar player. I love their very unique guitar writing, as well as the wide use of alternate tunings to come up with all of these really unorthodox ways of voicing chords and writing guitar parts. And I think this is a great record to introduce the listener to the very colorful, quirky, and unpredictable style that is so unique to the Pavement sound. It has 14 tracks, and they take us through quite the journey, weaving in and out of a lot of different styles. And because of its rawness, this album does seem to be an acquired taste for some people, but the people that do love it regard it as one of the most important indie rock albums of all time, and I would definitely agree with that sentiment. Now, I did mention that this is not my number one favorite Pavement album, and there are 2 reasons for that. If I was going to give this record any sort of mild critiques, I would say that as an overall album, I think it's very strong. It has really good pacing, and there's not very many skip-over tracks. But if we are talking individual tracks, I will say that this is one of the albums that doesn't really contain many of my favorite Pavement songs. So that is one thing that differentiates it from some of their other records. And also, this is the only album to feature Gary Young on drums. He would eventually leave the group over his crazy alcohol-infused behaviors and his difference in musical tastes from the rest of the group. And I do think the drumming improves from album 2 and onward when Steve West comes into the picture. But those are my only 2 mild critiques of this album. But from front to back, I think the majority of it is very consistent and enjoyable, with a lot of really great high points throughout, and only a few dips in momentum personally for me, but nothing major to the point where I feel like this album doesn't deserve to be an S tier, because the highs on this greatly outweigh the lows. The couple of tracks that I've never been crazy about are No Life, Sing to Her, Chesley's Little Wrists, and 2 States. As far as favorite tracks on here goes, hands down my number one favorite song is Here, and this would be the only song from this album that actually would make my top 10 list of favorite Pavement songs. I think that song is so beautiful and is the high point of this record. A couple of other favorites for me is Zurich is Stained, Fame Thrower, And the closer, Our Singer, which I think is a great closing track, a super cool, spacey, and moody song, really showing you the adventurous side of Pavement's writing and showing you that you can never predict where they're going to go from one song to the next, and a very interesting stylistic choice and mood to conclude this great album on. So an amazing debut album, one of the classic indie and lo-fi albums of all time, and the one studio album that really showcases the most raw side of Pavement's sound and taking the listener through such an enjoyable and adventurous 14-song journey. So a great debut album. This one gets an S. All right, moving on, we have their second studio album from 1994 titled Crooked Rain, Crooked Rain, and I will also give this one an S. Absolutely amazing album. This one veers away from the lo-fi production of the previous release, and this goes in a much cleaner direction and has this really great blend of indie rock, alternative rock, and some psychedelic and folk elements sprinkled into it as well. We have 12 songs on here, and I think the overwhelming majority of this album is amazing, and also from an individual track standpoint, it does contain a couple of songs that would make my top 10 favorite Pavement song list. In particular, I think the first 4 songs of this album are absolutely flawless, and I think it's probably the best succession of Pavement songs of any of their albums, in my opinion. Silence Kid brings everything in on the perfect feel-good vibe, and Elevate Me Later continues that mood and gets even more pretty. Stop Breathin' brings the tempo and mood down a bit and has this fascinating arpeggiated guitar part and another interesting alternate tuning. A song that really captures that perfect blend of quirky but also a little eerie at the same time. And then that is followed by one of Pavement's classics, Cut Your Hair, one of their most popular songs and just an incredibly solid and catchy indie pop song. I think the opening 4 songs are the high point of this album, and there is a song or two in the remainder of it that I wouldn't say that I love, but there are a lot of other really serious high points throughout the rest of this. A couple of tracks that I really love are Gold Sounds, Range Life, and the closer, Fillmore Jive. Range Life would end up being one of their most popular songs and would even take shots at the Smashing Pumpkins, which would spark a long feud between the band and Billy Corgan. I love Fillmore Jive as a closer too. Again, another amazing closing track. I like how the closer on this and on Slanted and Enchanted takes some unexpected shifts in mood to conclude the albums on. 5/4 equals Unity is also a surprising little detour that brings us into that 5/4 jazzy groove and gives us a taste of the more unpredictable elements of their writing that the next album would explore even more. The only 2 songs on here that I'm not crazy about are Newark Wilder and Heaven is a Truck. I've never really found either of those songs particularly interesting, but I think the remainder of the album is so solid and there are so many standout individual tracks that it wouldn't feel right putting this album anywhere but in S tier. So an amazing album, and in my opinion, an even further improvement upon the first release, so this one gets an easy S. All right, next we have their third studio album from 1995 titled Wowie Zowie, and I'm going to give this an A. I know some people will disagree with this score. A lot of diehard Pavement fans will say that this is their best album, but then some others will say that stylistically it's a little too scattered and long as an album, and I do tend to fall more into that camp. But with that being said, I will say that from an individual track standpoint, this album actually contains the largest amount of my favorite Pavement songs of any album. So even though there are some elements of this album that I don't enjoy as much, it certainly has some really incredible high points throughout it as well. This album shifts away from the more mainstream indie pop sound of the previous release, and this gets much more experimental and more unpredictable from track to track, having some songs that do sound like stuff from Crooked Rain, but also veering off into a lot of other territories that we hadn't heard up to this point. And I think the majority of what comes out of this experimental style of writing was very good, but like I said, I think my main gripe with the album is that because it's 18 tracks long and runs a total of 55 minutes, for me personally, there are more dips in momentum on here than a lot of their other works, and some of the stylistic choices don't resonate with me as much as some of the other Pavement sounds do. And because of the longer length of this album, the underwhelming moments do happen a little bit more than they did on Crooked Rain, Crooked Rain. So that would be my main reasoning for putting it in A tier, even though it does contain a few of my favorite Pavement songs. I will say I absolutely love the way the album opens with We Dance, bringing in this very pretty and delicate instrumentation of acoustic guitar and piano over the vocals, bringing us in on a more somber mood, and then following that up with Rattled by the Rush is just such a cool song with a really tasteful groove between the guitars and the drums, and definitely one of my favorite songs on here, and one that would make my list of top 10 favorite Pavement songs. And then Blackout is an even better follow-up track, a very pretty song with lush guitar parts and just great all-around vibes, another one that's on my top 10 list. And then Brink's Job changes up the vibe very nicely, giving us something a little more grittier. And then Grounded is another beautiful follow-up track and another one that makes my top 10 list. So this album actually has 3 songs that are on my top 10 favorite Pavement song list, which is more than any other album. But I will say, once we get to this point in the album after Grounded, there are still a lot of songs that I love, but this is where some of the dips and momentum do start to begin to happen. But these underwhelming moments are still sandwiched in between some really incredible songs that I think really carry the album to a very high degree. But a couple of the tracks that I don't really care about are Serpentine Pad, Motion Suggests, Best Friend's Arm, Flux Equals Rad, and the closer, Western Homes. Definitely my least favorite closing track of any of their albums up to this point. And because they are taking so many more liberties stylistically and really stretching out their sound on this one, I think it's understandable that not every single song on here is going to resonate with everyone. And for me personally, those are the ones on here that stylistically just don't do it for me as much. However, there are still some really great high points in the remainder of this album as well, like Grave Architecture, AT&T, Fight This Generation, Kennel District, and Half a Canyon. I particularly love the outro to Fight This Generation, one of my favorite moments of this entire album. I really love the eerie chord progression and the vibe. It almost reminds me of Sonic Youth, and I just love it so much. So even though I don't love every single song on here, I still really love about 85% of it, and like I said, it has 3 songs that are on my top 10 favorite song list, which is more than any other album, but still has a few too many skip over tracks to warrant putting it in S tier, but still a very fun and enjoyable album regardless of that, and one that I still hold in very high regard. So this one gets an A. Okay, moving on, we have their 4th studio album from 1997 titled Brighten the Corners, and this one will get an S. Incredible album, and believe it or not, this is actually my favorite Pavement album. Again, another one that a lot of people seem to be all over the place with, and when I went back and listened to their albums again, I was surprised that this one actually ended up being my favorite, because I remember after I initially heard it, I liked it a lot, but it didn't strike me as their best album. But after going back and re-listening, I think for me, what I love about this album so much is that it really delivers on all fronts. It contains a couple of tracks that make my top 10 favorite song list, but it is also very consistent from front to back, and in my opinion, it is the most consistent and cohesive Pavement album from a track quality standpoint as well as a stylistic standpoint. They return to more of that mainstream indie pop sort of sound that we heard more on Crooked Rain, and they deliver us 12 tracks, and honestly, I think from tracks 1 to 11, they just give us these incredibly consistent, high quality songs, no skip over tracks, and just enough variety from track to track to keep things interesting, but not as big of a stylistic shift that we had heard from Wowie Zowie. And for me personally, this just provides for a more concise and enjoyable listen. From the first half of the album, my 4 favorite tracks are Stereo, Shady Lane, Transport is Arranged, and Type Slowly. I really love the guitar parts on Transport is Arranged. For the second half, my favorites are Embassy Row, Blue Hawaiian, We Are Underused, and Starlings of the Slipstream. Blue Hawaiian, I think, is a really nice change in vibe to mix things up a bit as we get closer to the end of the album. It's got a really fascinating and dissonant chord at the beginning of one of the chord progressions that I love so much, and Starlings of the Slipstream has some really beautiful guitar and vocal parts, and I would say that that track is a very underrated Pavement song. For some reason, I've just never been the biggest fan of the closing track of the album. No matter how many times I've listened to it, I just can't get into it, and it's unfortunate because if it wasn't for this one track, I think this entire album would be perfect. But certainly not a huge deal in the grand scheme of this record. I really do think that tracks 1 through 11 are just spotless, very enjoyable listens with just enough variety to keep things interesting, but not to lose that feeling of clarity and cohesion that this album gives us. Stereo and Shady Lane would be the 2 songs on here that make my top 10 favorite song list, and the remainder of the album, with the exception of Finn, I would consider to be all very high quality and enjoyable Pavement songs. So a very high quality and consistent album, my number 1 Pavement album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, and last we have their 5th and most recent studio album from 1999 titled Terror Twilight, and I'm going to give this one a B. Not a bad album, but for me personally, I do think this is the weakest album of their discography. This was the last album of their contract under Matador, and there was a lot of tension between the band and Malkmus at this time, and they would end up being done as a band by the year 2000 after this album was released. And in the midst of these growing tensions, I still think that a lot of this album is very good, and there are definitely some good qualities about it that I really enjoy. I think Nigel Godrich does a great job on the production, and I do think about 6 to 7 of the songs on here are enjoyable. The opening track, Spit on a Stranger, in particular, is a very beautiful song and one of the strongest opening tracks of any Pavement album, in my opinion. You Are a Light is another amazing and very vibey track, and those 2 songs in particular would be the 2 highest points of this album for me and would both make my top 10 favorite song list. A couple of other tracks I enjoy on here are Cream of Gold, Major Leagues, Billy, The Hex, and the closing track, Carrot Rope. I love the change in mood on the final 2 tracks, going from The Hex into Carrot Rope. The Hex has this really dark and ominous vibe that I love so much. A really nice, surprising change of mood to set up the final song of the album very nicely. But I do find a couple of the other tracks on here pretty underwhelming, like Folk Jam, Platform Blues, and Don't Cry, and Speak, See, Remember. I do enjoy the other 7 songs though, but only 2 of them I would regard as really exceptional Pavement songs, and I would say that the other ones that I like are good more in a sense of comparing them to the other tracks on this album, but they wouldn't go down as really memorable Pavement songs for me in the grand scheme of their discography personally, and I'm sure a lot of that was largely due to how much tension was in the band at that time, and I'm sure it's only natural that that will affect the writing process. So it is my least favorite Pavement album, but certainly not a bad album either, just in my opinion not as good as the other 4 releases. So this one will get a B. And following this album, the band will be broken up by the year 2000, but they would eventually reunite in 2010 for a tour, and then they would take another break until 2019 when they would get back together for another tour, but it would end up being delayed until 2022 because of COVID. But as of now, when I'm recording this in 2023, they are still currently touring. So who knows what the future holds for Pavement. It would be wild if there was ever a new album to come out, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. It seems more likely that it's not going to, just based on what Steven has said. And since there hasn't been an album since 1999, I'm not going to keep my hopes up, but me personally, I would love a 6th album, and I think they would probably have some really amazing stuff to put out there at this point. But that is it. We did it. We went through all 5 of their studio albums, and this is what I came up with. This was a very fun and enjoyable discography to revisit, and this is definitely one of those bands that I would say does not have a bad album. Each album offers some very high quality stuff, and even though I don't necessarily love every single song that they put out on every every album. I think the overwhelming amount of music that Pavement has put out has been incredibly unique, hugely influential, and always authentic to their very unique fusion of different influences and styles to create this amazing musical stew that is the Pavement sound. And I would say they were one of the most important bands of the indie rock movement in the 90s, and a few of their albums would definitely make it onto my top 90s album list. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was enjoyable and hopefully you learned a thing or two. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out my other tier lists, which will be linked in the comments and the description, and see if there's anything else that you might like. I've been doing these for a while now, so there are a bunch more listed in the tier list playlist. So please check that out. And like I said, please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 5 albums. So please let me know. All right, that is it for today. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.